And good morning, everyone. Happy Tuesday morning to you. Appreciate you being with me. This is my morning musings. My name is Don K. Preston of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And we're looking at the eschatology of the parables of Jesus. Well, we come to a parable that a lot of people don't believe has anything to do with eschatology. I used to believe that, well, it's just a wonderful story of God's grace. And listen, until I really began to dig into the story of what we call the Prodigal Son, I have to tell you, I honestly had no concept of God's grace. Some years ago, I did a series of lessons on the parables. It's available on my website. Tell you more about it at the end of this session. When I came to really study the parable of the prodigal son in its original historical context, and I began to read books focusing on Jewish thought, Hebraic thought, Hebraic culture, social norms of the time. I was literally stunned to learn about God's grace in a way I had never, ever imagined it. Now, I'm not going to focus on that very much. I just want you to know that in the story of the prodigal son, there is an expression of grace. Now, some people, I believe, carry the concept of God's grace too far, and say that God's grace covers anything, everything, no matter what. Well, actually, this parable proves otherwise. But be that as it may, what the parable does teach us is that God's grace is incredible. You're familiar with the parable of the prodigal son. Man had two sons. The young son came to the father and said, "Give me my inheritance. I'm sick and tired of living at home." I suspect that there are a lot of viewers who can relate to that. I'm out of here. Don't want to be at home anymore. I'm gone. And the father, remarkably, against almost any social norm of the time, gave that son his inheritance. And the son went into the far country, spent his entire inheritance living it up, and he went broke. Famine evidently hit the country, couldn't find a job. He's almost assuredly in a foreign country because he winds up feeding hogs. Well, Jews, as a general rule, didn't raise pigs. So he's in a foreign country with people who are raising pigs. And he winds up not only feeding the pigs, but eating with them. How humiliating for a Jewish young man. Finally, he came to himself. And he said, "I'm going home. And I'm going to tell my father I am unworthy to be called your son. Make me a servant. Just let me live in your house." The father saw him coming, which says he was looking for him, and ran out to greet him. Can you imagine how dirty, filthy, stinking the young man was? His clothes bedraggled. And the father hugged him and kissed him. Said to the servants, "Kill the fatted calf, put the very best robe on him. Because my son, who was dead, is now alive. The older son said, "Hey, Dad, what in the world's going on? What in the world is going on? You know, I just don't get it. I've stayed here. I've been faithful. I've never broken any of your rules. I've been basically a slave in your house, and you've never once made a feast for me." And the father responded, "But son, you don't understand. Your brother, my son, was dead, and now he's come home. He's alive. You should be rejoicing with me." As Jesus concludes the parable, he has the father saying, "It was right that we should make merry and be glad. Your brother was dead and is alive again. He was lost, and now he's found." Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, I used to think this is not a story of eschatology. But I want to suggest to you that when we look at the story of the prodigal son in the context of the Old Testament and the story of the 10 tribes of Israel versus the 2 tribes of Israel within the context of the prophecy of the last days and the restoration of Israel. And there's nothing more eschatological than that. All of a sudden, Luke chapter 15 becomes a powerful, powerful statement that the last days had arrived in the first century, that resurrection was about to take place. But of course, resurrection is being defined for us in this text in a way that modern Christianity doesn't grasp, seemingly so. But the point being, when we see this story, this parable, in the context of the restoration of Israel, it is intensely eschatological, and it falsifies every futurist eschatology. And I'll demonstrate that as we proceed. Now, I did an entire series of lessons on the prodigal son. I emphasized the grace of God. I emphasized the eschatology. This is a 32-lesson series on the parables. I examined many of the parables of Jesus and the eschatology there, but I want to tell you, I enjoyed developing the parable of the prodigal son probably more than any of the other parables. I think if you listen to those lessons, you too will stand amazed at the amazing grace of the God we serve. Not only did he extend that grace to Israel, he opened his arms wide, and he extends that grace to all of the nations that he created. Psalm 68. So go to my website, order The Parables of Jesus by Don Preston, mention that you saw the offer on YouTube or Facebook, and I'll refund your shipping. Thanks so much for joining me for this morning's Morning Musings. We'll see you on the flip side as we develop the parable of the prodigal son.